Hey everybody, welcome back to You in a Garage. Today we are going to be installing a PSC Hydro Boost kit in BYT here. Time for some more upgrades. Now, we're not going to go full hydro because this thing's going to be driven on the street. Full hydro, if you don't know, is when you replace your steering box with a ram on the axle, and that's the only thing that is steering your rig. Well, Hydro Assist, you keep the steering box, but you add a ram to help out so that when you're jammed up against the rocks and all that, you can still steer. So we've got all the lines we're going to need for everything. I added, where is it? This one here. Got a few extra lines because I've got Hydro Boost. So when you call them and get your system set up, let them know about that, and they can get you hooked up there too. So let's start taking the old stuff off the Blazer so that we can start cleaning things up and getting this stuff installed. All right, we've got the pump pulled out. With this LS engine, it's way easier just to pull the whole bracket, so I did that. Now we need to get this pump off, and we'll see about putting the new pump on. Ran to the local auto parts store and got their pulley puller. Now let's get this thing taken care of. Take a little more oomph than that. Well, that could have been bad. All right, you're just gonna have to wait on this one. Okay. Get that off, we can get the last bolt out. We're so close. Okay. Here's the old pump and here's the new pump and its pulley. Now, the stock pump has its reservoir on the pump itself. This one does not, so it may look different, but you can see the bolt holes are the same. The difference on this is we're going to have a remote reservoir. So this reservoir is where you're going to hold all of your fluid. We'll mount it up somewhere up here. Anyway, now that we've got the old pump pulled off, let's clean this bracket up before we start mounting our new parts. All right, we've got the bracket as cleaned up as we can get it. So now we can mount the new pump to the bracket. Now, before we do that, we're going to go ahead and mount up the new pulley because with the slots, it's going to be super easy to do that. And then we don't have to worry about doing the pulley while it's on the truck. Note, the new pulley, as you can see here, is about 3/4 of an inch smaller than the old pulley. I don't know if you can see that, but quite a bit smaller. That's going to make the pump spin a lot faster. But it might mean we're going to have to get a new belt. See when we get that far. Anyway, let's get the pulley put on and get this mounted to the bracket. Well, I spoke too soon about being able to put the pulley on and then mount this to the bracket. Because of the pulley smaller, we got an issue with this bolt hole right here. You can see, super easy to get that one in, That one, no problem. This one, it's lining up with the edge of the pulley. So it's not going to work. So we got to pull the pulley off, mount the pump, and then mount the pulley again. Minor setback, no big deal. All right, on the back side of the pumps, we have this extra bracket on, at least on this engine. So pull that off, and then we're going to need to pull these two studs off and replace those here. Voila, brackets in place. All right, what I'm trying to do here is figure out exactly where I want this reservoir to be. Now, here's the hose coming from the pump. It's just on there loosely right now. And this is where it's got to go into the reservoir. And I think what I want is for the reservoir to end up right about here. Okay, we took our measurements with everything in the engine bay, and now we've got the bracket out here on the bench. And where we want the reservoir is basically 2 inches back from the front of the bracket here, 1 inch up and 1 inch out. So approximately right there. So we're going to build an adapter off here. We're going to be able to get a bolt down here, a couple bolts up here. So we should get some triangulation to, so it mounts nice and steady. And then we need to bolt that to the reservoir. Now, the kit comes with this mounting bracket for the reservoir, but I don't think we're going to be using that. On the back of the reservoir here, you can see there's 4 bolt holes here. I think that that's going to make more sense for what we want to do. So we'll build our bracket to basically sit this on, and then it will bolt in on all 4 of those bolts, and that should give us a good solid mounting surface. All right, we've got our cardboard template put together. It's a little more complicated than I had hoped, but it is what it is. So that's going to fit right there. And that will hold that right there exactly where we want it. So got to turn this into sheet metal. I'm going to use 16 gauge. I'm going to try and keep it light. And hopefully that'll still be strong enough. We're going to use the structure of the bracket to add strength rather than just using heavier metal. See how it turns out. All right, we've got all our pieces cut up, bent into shape. That's going to fit on there. This is the piece that goes here. And then we have our triangular brace that's going to go into there. All right, we've got our bracket completely made, all painted up. It's ready to install. So let's get this thing put together so we can install it back on the truck. There it is. All right, let's get it installed in the truck. All right, we've got our accessory bracket put back on. We've got our reservoir mounted. That's good and solid. So now, I think the next step we're going to do is we're going to run the line from the reservoir down to the pump. Okay. This one goes together pretty easy because this is not going to be under pressure. Okay. That's on. That in position, I think it needs to be. And let's mark the hose. All right, let's cut it down and put it together. All right, hose is cut to length. Both ends are on. Let's put her together. Now, luckily, both ends of this are swivel ends, so it should make getting this together a lot easier. Okay. There we go. Now you're going to want to be careful not to cross thread these. Should turn pretty darn easily right up until the end. There we go. Now that we've got the reservoir installed and run the line from the reservoir down to the pump, let's go ahead and install the rest of the components before we worry about how to route all the rest of the hoses. All right, we just ran into a problem with hooking up our steering box to our steering shaft. This end is different than the end on our old steering box. Evidently, there's two different sizes, and we had the smaller size before, and we need the bigger size. So, yeah, we're going to have to either replace the box or replace this joint. I'm going to see if I can replace this. Got to do some research, see what I can find out. All right, you're supposed to do this before you actually order your steering kit, but basically you need to measure how much travel back and forth you have so you can make sure you can get the correct ramp. How you do that? Put a straight edge on the axle, move it all the way from one side bank a mark, push it all the way to the other side, make another mark, and then you can measure between those two marks to see how much travel you actually have. Now I measured 8 3/4 inches, and I just got through checking the ram, and the ram I got is 8 5/8 inches, which is perfect. You want the ram to be the new steering stops on either end so that the ram can't push your components farther than they are capable of going. So now it's time to mount the ram. Now I'm going to be mounting the ram on the diff cover here because I have these mounts that work with this diff cover. And then on the other end here, we're going to be on the tie rod, just like that. So let's get this tacked on, and then we'll check and make sure we don't have anything interfering or binding. All right, I switched some actual leather gloves so I don't hurt myself, and added a couple of stronger tacks so that we can move this thing around. So we are pushed all the way to the passenger side here. You see the ram extending. And we're touching the bump stop here. And the ram is all the way extended there. So bump stop to bump stop. And no binding. All right, that looks good. We're ready to burn these tabs the rest of the way in. All right, the hoses are now hooked up to the ram. As you can see, I've pointed the fittings away from the steering box. And what this does, it gives me a nice loop here. So I've got plenty of travel. So I'm not going to have to worry about these lines getting stretched or bound up or anything like that. And then the driver's side fitting comes up here and connects to the back port. Front port goes to the passenger side. Okay, here you can see the cooler mounted up behind my winch, so it's good and protected. And got the passenger side line loops up and around, and that's going to go return up to the reservoir. And this side comes directly off of the return port on the power steering gearbox. All right, here's the top ports on the steering gearbox. This line runs up to the output from the Hydro Boost on my application. This is the return line, and it's plumbed over to the cooler. Now the kit comes with enough fittings and hoses to make all new lines, but I liked the way my original line fit between the Hydro Boost and the gearbox, and the same with the line that I'd already built. I'd already bent it up for a cooler I had installed before, so I went ahead and just reused those two hoses. All right, moving on with the rest of the routing. This line on the Hydro Boost goes directly down to the pump. This is the return line for the Hydro Boost. Goes into this port on the reservoir. This is the return line that comes from the cooler. And of course, this line goes down to the pump. This line in back here, right there, this is the line that goes down to the steering box. All right, with all the plumbing done, let's get the steering shaft put back on. It can be difficult to tell what size of an input shaft you have on your steering box. I've got two different GM steering boxes here. This one is a 13/16 36 spline. This one is a 3/4 inch 30 spline. However, when you measure the input shafts, you don't get those numbers. So how do you know for sure? Well, the easiest way is to count the number of splines. On this 13/16 36 spline, I actually only counted 30 splines, which can cause some confusion because the 3/4 is a 30 spline. So you have to take into account the fact that because the flat is machined onto this, it's removing some splines. So you can take the fact that there's a flat there and just round up to the next number and you'll probably be safe. Or the way they recommend it is you draw a center line on your input shaft, count the splines on the half without the flat, and then just double your number. A quick trick I was able to use to help me count the splines was to take a nice close-up picture of the end of the input shaft, blow it up nice and big, and it made it a lot easier to count those splines. All right, I've come up with a solution to fix the problem that the new steering box input shaft is different than the old steering box. This is the shaft I'm using to connect my steering column, and I'm going to replace this U-joint that fits that steering box with this one, a much more modern and sleek one, of course, that will fit the new steering shaft. That's it. The whole system's plumbed. Everything's set up. So the only thing left to do is to fill it full of fluid and go through the bleeding procedure.
When everything is hooked up, it's time to fill the reservoir with fluid. Once it's full, you need to get the front wheels up off the ground so that you can cycle the steering. A lot. It's important to note that you're going to be doing this without the engine running. Having the pump spinning while you're trying to bleed the system is just going to aerate the fluid and make it take a lot longer. While cycling the steering, be sure to go slowly and watch the fluid levels in the reservoir so that you don't spill over like I just did here. Keep cycling the steering and topping off the fluid as necessary until the bubbles stop coming up through the reservoir. Once the fluid stops bubbling, you're done. A bubble or two coming up from the center bolt is just fine. Screw on the cap, check for leaks, and enjoy your Hydro Assist steering.